Well, it's with the utmost delicacy and tact that I broach the subject I'm about to speak about right now. And that's because it's a safety issue, and it's a touchy issue. And a lot of people think it's real simple, but actually it's very complicated with this firearm. And what I'm talking about is the finger in the trigger guard issue with a single action Army. And before we start, I'll just verify this gun is unloaded for the demonstrations I'm going to show you. So the gun safety rule is you always have your finger out of the trigger guard unless you're aiming at a target and taking fire. Certainly on holstering, on unholstering, during the draw, during any kind of reload or anything. With all guns, you keep your finger outside the trigger guard. That's the safety rule. It's a very good safety rule. I believe in it. I really try to follow it. And the reason I bring this up with the single action Army is it's a unique gun. It's a very unique gun in that it was designed in 1873, and it's really it's a later generation of the cap and ball open top revolvers, and they all had this basic design. And back then, they didn't worry about finger in the trigger guard at all because these were single actions, and the trigger does not make the gun fire ever by itself. You have to cock the gun, then you can fire it. That's how it works. And so because of that, with a single action revolver, if that's all you ever shot, it would be safe to have your finger in here as long as the hammer wasn't cocked. And these guns, they're designed to have your finger in the trigger guard, and not having it there, sometimes it feels like putting a shoe on the wrong foot. You know, that your finger naturally wants to go in there more with this gun than any other. You know, with the semi-automatic, the trigger has one function. The trigger breaks a shot with a semi-auto. That's all that trigger does, breaks a shot. This gun has at least 4 functions, okay? One is when the hammer's cocked, it fires the gun. Another one is when the hammer's cocked but you don't want to fire a gun, you hold the hammer back, activate the trigger, and then uncock the gun. That's a second function. Another function is when you went into the reloading phase, okay, and you want to lock the cylinder up again, you can't just pull on the hammer because it cocks it. You have to activate the hammer and decock it. So to come out of the loading phase is another reason why you use that hammer. And the last reason is one most people don't use, but I do. When you hold back the trigger, now you can fan the gun. It activates the hammer for fanning. So there's at least 4 functions of that trigger. It's different than a semi-automatic. Now, does that mean it's okay to shoot and handle this gun with your finger in the trigger, unholstering, all that stuff? No, it's not a good idea. Primarily because you might take that habit into your semi-automatics, which would cause you to have an accident. With the semi-auto, it's critical to not have your finger in the trigger guard when you reholster. Because when you do, if you imagine this is semi-automatic, my finger's in the trigger guard and I go to reholster. On this gun, the holster's cut a little bit. On a semi-automatic holster, the holster would press your finger against the trigger and virtually assure that you're going to shoot that gun. So it's a very bad habit to have with a semi-automatic. So it's a good idea for everybody to not do that. Now, I shot semi-autos a lot before I went to the single action Army. I mean, I shot single action Armies, but as far as really training in hundreds of thousands of rounds and stuff, that was with the semi-autos. And that trigger finger outside the trigger guard is something that's very important. I learned that. I ingrained that. I shot matches like that. If they catch you doing a match, you get a DQ. You don't get to shoot anymore that day. So I learned to do that. And yet when I went to the single action Army, without thinking about it, I gradually started running around with my finger in that trigger guard. And some guys have called me out on it in videos. They see me holstering with my finger in the trigger guard sometimes. And I always say, you're right, man. I did. You're right. I shouldn't do that. You know. But I don't feel anything like I would feel if I did it with a semi-auto. If I did it with a semi-auto, that's like, man, that's super bad. With a single action Army, I don't beat myself up over it. I try not to do it, but I do it a lot because the gun just, it pulls that finger in there. But it's not dangerous with a single action Army. So it's still something I work on, and I recommend everybody else do too, but it is a little bit of a different issue. I know people are going to argue with me about this, but if you have a single action Army, a lot of these guys argue they don't have these. And if they do, they don't shoot them much. And even if they do shoot them, they don't shoot them like me. They don't handle them as much as I do. Holstering, unholstering, fanning, all these things that I do. if you start handling the gun a lot, that finger's going to drift in there. It just is. When you handle the gun, you're always doing this. You know, you put in 2 rounds, you want to rotate it around, your finger goes in there all the time. So it's something I strive for, but after all those years of learning it with semi-auto, when I went to the single action Army, I find I'm not doing it all the time. There was another point I was going to make. I remember the point I was going to bring up. Okay, so I shot the semi-autos for a long time. Finger out of the trigger guard, thousands of draws, 10,000s of draws, you know. And no problem with that, no bad habit. I start handling this gun, and I catch myself finger in the trigger guard. And here's another thing too. When I'm fanning the gun, this doesn't make it go bang ever. If I'm fanning it, the hammer does. It's that makes it go. So in my brain, I switched over. In my brain, this became the trigger. This is what I watched out for. And that happened instantly as soon as I started to fan the gun. And so when I began giving this a lot more respect than I had on any other gun, I didn't, my brain just switched off from worrying about the trigger guard. Still, like I say, keep your finger out of the trigger guard. I try to also. But here's the weird thing. Where it's dangerous is if you pick up this bad habit, then you go back to a semi-auto, you can have an accident. And I was worried about that. When I went back to a semi-auto, started training again and practicing a little bit, I wondered, am I going to have my finger in the trigger guard? And I didn't, ever. It was just my brain interprets semi-auto, finger out of the trigger guard, single action Army, not so important. And that's just the way that I handle it. You may not be able to handle it like that. If you pick up this bad habit of finger in the trigger guard all the time, you may not get rid of it when you go to a semi-auto, especially if you never established it in depth in a semi-auto first, like I did. So that's just my experience. I'm not saying it's okay to keep your finger in the trigger guard. I'm just saying, in my case, I can switch back and forth. So that was the thing I forgot to say. That's my thoughts on that. Keep your finger out of the trigger guard, but if you have a single action Army, you're gonna have a hard time doing it. With the Ruger Vaquero, that's one of the reasons I think they made it longer across here. It's a lot easier to keep your finger out of that trigger guard with a Ruger. You know, that's one superior design factor to it. This gun, of course you can do it, but it's awkward, you know. So that was my 2 cents on keeping finger out of the trigger guard as it pertains to a single action Army. Thanks for watching.